Salutations! My name is Becca and welcome to Words and Other Malarkey. This is Lessons from My Bookshelf, where I go through all of the books in my home library, talk about the writing lessons, and talk about what I like and dislike about each book. So today's book is Storyteller by Edward Myers, and this is an old favorite of mine, and I kind of came across it randomly, like just was at the library one day and picked it out and was like, oh, this is really cool. So it was one of those like happenstance sort of things. I hadn't heard of it before, hadn't heard of the author before. I hadn't read it in a long time, and the reason I own it is because I got like an Amazon gift card one time for like my birthday or something, and I liked the book so much that I wanted to own it. It's like the first book I ever ordered offline, maybe the only book I've ever ordered offline. And unless I'm totally misremembering, I swear that this was like 1 cent on Amazon. I don't know if it was like a glitch or what. I just remember that it was like suspiciously cheap, and I ordered it anyway, and it came and it was exactly what I ordered. This is the book. Wasn't like, yeah, nothing weird about it. It was just somehow only 1 cent. I don't know, maybe it was like used and somebody just really didn't care how much they got for it. I mean, like, it says it's worth like 16 bucks. So, I mean, great deal, right? Storyteller is by Edward Myers, and I haven't read any of his other works. However, in middle school, I did a big book report about Storyteller, and then I emailed it to Edward Myers, and God bless the man, he wrote me back and said that it was good. And then we kind of like emailed back and forth because, like, you know, I was really excited to talk to an actual published author, so I was asking him questions about how to become a writer, and he gave me some really good advice that I actually still use to this day. So shout out to Edward Myers. Thank you for inspiring me, because you really did, and really made an 11-year-old's day way back when. Still have those emails too. I swear, like deep in the archives of my Yahoo. Oh my God. Okay, so Storyteller is kind of a fairy tale, and it's very, I think, similar in tone to The Tale of Despero. So it's interesting that these are back to back. I don't know, I've never found anything quite like this, but I haven't read a whole lot of fairy tales since the old middle school days. So as you can see by the title, Storyteller is about a storyteller. And it's really cool because it's not a perspective that you see very often in fairy tales. I mean, it's kind of meta because it's a story about a storyteller. So you got like these stories within stories within stories. And there's actually a part where he's messing with one of the characters, and he starts telling a story and then about a storyteller who then starts telling a story about a storyteller, and it goes on until the character eventually just gets mad and tells him to stop. But it really it plays around with conventions because you are writing a story about stories in a sense. So like I touched a lot in The Tale of Despero about how like the narrator like kind of lays bare the conventions of fiction and of fairy tales and makes you think and draws attention to itself. And Storyteller kind of does some similar things, but in like different ways. I mean, I think Despero and Storyteller are two very different books, but they have a lot of parallels. One of the big things is that I know that I compared Despero to Princess Bride, and actually this one is more like Princess Bride in the way it's structured than Despero is, because you are literally sitting in on a grandfather telling his grandson this story. So whereas like Tale of Despero, you don't really know who the narrator is. There's like some suspicion by the end that it might be Despero telling you this story, but you're never really sure, and I don't think it really matters. In this story, it's very clear by the end who the narrator is, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but you know who it is by the end. And also, whereas Despero, like, the narrator's like interjections were kind of just woven into the narrative, this one will pull you out with like a different font and with a section break whenever you're back in like the cottage with the grandfather and the grandson, and he's asking questions. So it's really fun, and it's so pretty classic frame tale, I guess would be the name for it. So okay, here's what it's about. Aside from a storyteller. So there's this farm boy named Jack, and he has a talent for telling stories. This isn't a very usual talent for someone in his village, but he decides that he's going to go to the royal city and seek his fortune and tell his stories, and that's what he does. But when he gets there, he kind of gets swept up into the king's court because the king throughout the kingdom is kind of known for being a bad king. But what Jack learns ultimately is that he's not really bad in the sense of like tyrannical. He's just kind of checked out. What happened was his wife died, and so he just got really depressed and kind of just retreated into himself and let the kingdom go to ruin. And everybody resents him for it, but Jack kind of sees that this is just a guy who's just really sad and tries to help him. So the reason Jack ends up at the court is because the king's son, who you will learn to hate very, very quickly, this 12-year-old, has stuck a ruby up his nose. This book's pretty comical, just so you know. Stuck a ruby up his nose, and nobody can get it out. The physicians can't do anything about it. So the king's just like, well, maybe a storyteller will just help him, make him feel better. But Jack's really clever, so he's like, maybe I can tell a story that'll make him sneeze. And he does, and the prince sneezes out the ruby, which also has the best onomatopoeia for a sneeze that I have ever seen. It's that. It's like Edward Myers just like smashed the keyboard, but I feel like he probably spent a lot of time like formulating this particular group of letters to like really sound like a sneeze, and it's freaking amazing. Like, it's just a great moment. Just because usually it's just achoo, and yeah, achoo is fine, but like that's not really what a sneeze sounds like. It sounds like at least some people's sneezes do. Mine do. Maybe you have like a cute little achoo sneeze. Some of us have horse sneezes. And so he ends up employed by the king, and the king, even though he's really sad, he still like has his royal artists try to cheer him up, and no one can really do it. And so Jack tries to do it and fails, and then in the process he falls in love with the princess, of course, as one does, and she falls in love with him too. And he has just like started to get the king out of his slump, and the king's starting to like be a king again, and he like blesses the marriage and everything, and then he mysteriously dies. And through some court shenanigans, the 12-year-old ends up the king, and he does not like Jack. He is not into it. At first, Jack just thinks it's because he embarrassed him with the ruby thing, but it ends up being just like the kid's just kind of messed up. Yikes. And so this new king, the 12-year-old, makes Jack and the princess go around the kingdom telling tales of his greatness, even though he hasn't done anything because he's just a 12-year-old brat. And Jack and the princess think that by telling lies to the villagers that they'll see through the bullshit and just like rise up against this evil adolescent king. But it has mixed results, and so that's without giving anything away, that's basically the plot. So one of the big things with Jack is that he mostly tells stories that are true. Now, keep in mind, this isn't a fantasy world where there's like talking animals and magic and stuff, but like the average villager doesn't really know or hasn't really seen it, so like it's kind of a fable to them. But most of the stories he tells are true, even if the people listening don't believe they're true. And so Jack's kind of philosophy throughout the story, and the thing that he kind of sees challenged, is that the truth is the best story you can tell. Because he does that, and he does that for the king. Essentially, what snaps the king out of his like gloomy stupor is Jack decides to tell basically a thinly veiled metaphor in the form of a story about the king ruining his kingdom and his life. It's kind of like, King David and Bathsheba, if you know that story of he got into some trouble with another man's wife, and then the prophet Nathan was like, hey, let me tell you the story about this guy who had all these sheep, and then he just steals this one really nice guy's one sheep and then kills the guy. And then King David's like, oh man, I hate this guy. And then Nathan's like, yeah, you're the guy. So it's basically that, but the king is just depressed. Anyways, didn't know you're gonna get a Sunday school lesson in here too, right? Okay, so moving on. The truth ends up snapping the king out of his depression, which is really interesting. And a really cool quote that comes out of that that the king says. So after he tells him the story, at first he's like really mad, right? And then he thinks about it for a while. Jack just is like stuck in his room and thinks he's gonna die. And then the king calls him to his throne room and tells him, you alone have told me not what you believe I want to hear, but what I must hear. It seems that no one else was willing to tell me the truth. Everyone tried instead to humor me with sickly sweet candies. Everyone but you. Your medicine is bitter indeed, but it's the cure I need. And that becomes kind of a recurring theme because one of the big tensions is that there's this other character who's an illusionist named Zephyrio, and he's kind of the puppet master for the evil 12-year-old king. He's in on the whole scheme. And he believes the opposite, that people don't want the truth. They just want to be entertained. They just want to be distracted. Jack likes to tell stories that have like moral lessons or that in some way benefit the listeners. And Zephyrio's like, yeah, people are too stupid. All they want is just a distraction from their problems. They don't want to learn anything. And Jack's like, no, you're wrong. So here's what happens that really makes this theme kind of deep is when the 12-year-old, I should call them by their names, Yas, when King Yas takes over, even the name like makes you cringe. Anyway, so Yas is the king, and he wants them, to go on this campaign and basically just push propaganda about him. And so Jack thinks that by telling lies, the villagers will see through them and be like, oh, this guy is, full of crap. But what ends up happening is really nothing. The villagers are like disenchanted, but they just kind of go on with their miserable lives. There's really like this band of rebels somewhere like kind of off screen, so to speak, that are doing things, but only because they're taking action in their own subversive way. They're not like they didn't take action because they heard the lies or anything like that. All they end up seeing Jack as is just like one of the king's minions. And so for like the first part of their campaign, they're not really buying it, but like nobody's like rising up. And then the king starts having Jack and others put on plays about him, and then the villagers start actually believing the lies. And Jack's like, oh no, that's not good. And so like in a way, like Zephyrio ends up kind of right that people just want to be entertained. And in another way, it's like really kind of relevant, like with the media and how there's like a lot of lying that goes on in the media, but people just kind of believe it if you're not told any differently or told to like pay attention to what you're hearing. You just believe whatever you're told. Don't mean to go like super deep here, and I definitely don't want to get political, but it's interesting to see it in like this medieval themed story, because what ends up happening in the end, without spoiling anything, is that instead of like trying to be subversive and undermine the king using really theoretical tactics, what ends up really saving the kingdom and setting them free is the truth. And the reason that Jack wasn't telling the truth because he was scared. And so he gets over his fear and he tells the truth, and then everybody is like, oh yeah, I see it now. So there's a lot of talk about storytelling and the process of storytelling, how stories are thought up, who you tell them to, when you tell them. And that's where the whole discussion of should stories be entertaining or should they be teaching you a lesson, that's where that really comes in, because Jack wants people to really think when he tells his stories. And there's a lot of scenes when he is telling one to the king, whoever the king is in that situation, and at the end they kind of like pace And they're like, but what does it mean? Why did you tell me this story? And Jack's just like, it was the story you needed to hear, I guess. And so, was the case, like the most extreme case is when he tells like the snap out of it story to Alphonse, but the rest are just kind of like, they think they're going to get one thing, but they end up getting another. And Jack's just like, I don't know. It's like, this is just a story I'm telling you, so take it or leave it. And his process of coming up with stories is either it's actually a true story, like I said before, and he just kind of maybe like changes one or two details, and then people just kind of draw their own conclusions from there. Or he thinks up a story that basically mirrors whatever situation the person listening is in, but with like a lesson or with an outcome that's supposed to make them kind of feel encouraged or feel something at the end, aside from just entertained. Oh, that was a great story. So he has kind of an organic storytelling method, and I don't know a whole lot about like oral storytelling, but when it comes to thinking up stories, I mean, a lot of times you just tell the story you want, and usually when you get stuck is when you try to think, oh, what will people think of this, or like what do people want to hear. That's where like the bad stuff comes out usually. And I've dealt with that a lot, especially recently. Is like, oh, people aren't gonna like this. What do they want to see? Especially because nowadays we're so oversaturated with stories and we've seen everything and there's all these tropes that people don't like or that have just been used so many times, there's really no way to rehash it, but like you've absorbed so much of it that you can't help but work it into your story. So I don't want to overthink this book because really it's just a great fairy tale. It's very well written. It has a lot of great comedic moments, but it still has like a real kind of serious, almost like burdened feel to it. Maybe because there's a lot of characters that have like some real baggage. Jack really doesn't. I mean, he's grown up in like a poor village, but he hasn't had like the hardest time, but other characters have. So everybody's kind of got something that they got to work through. But you really like feel for the characters. One of the best ones I think is actually his sidekick, who's a bird. I don't know what it is about these animal characters lately that like I've been really like vibing with them because usually I don't like non-human protagonists, but his bird friend Laquasto is like kind of like comic relief, but also just kind of the one that calls Jack out on his bullshit too. So he's a real fun character. I think you'll really like most of the characters in this book, and I think you'll like that it really thinks a lot about what goes into stories and the craft of storytelling. And even though it's a fairy tale about how fairy tales come to be. I think that's all that I need to say about Storyteller. It's a great book. I think it's a little slower paced than maybe I remembered. And I don't want to say that like it's a bad thing, but like what I mean is there's not a whole lot of big action. There's a lot of scenes, there's a lot of things happening, but there's no fights, there's no like magic battles or anything like that. Like most of the action just comes from characters getting into situations and like just problem solving. So if like you really like a lot of action in your stories, maybe this will feel like a little bit boring to you, but I don't want to say it's a boring book. It just moves a little bit slower. This is technically middle grade, but it doesn't feel like middle grade. It really doesn't. I mean, Jack's supposed to be like 17. This princess is like 18. I think it's more of a reading level thing, but I wouldn't even put it in like a middle grade category. It's just YA. It's good YA. Next time I'm reading The Kingdom Keepers by Ridley Pearson. It's set in Disney World, which is very interesting, and it's a very interesting book, so that'll be fun and kind of a diversion from, I mean, we're still basically in the fantasy genre, but at least this one will be in like the modern day. So all right, until next time, keep it weird and go read some stories. Storyteller, fun. Tell your story, tell your truth. are you looking at me? This is me just going off the rails, man. Why? This would be good for some outtakes. Like we're cool enough to do outtakes.